Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us in this rather spontaneous meeting that we've put together. It's not our usual Thursday, it's a Tuesday, but we thought it's very important to discuss the situation in the Ukraine. We should say from the outset, none of us are experts on the matter. We are not, Russianologists or whatever the word is, but we represent sort of the view of the Labour Left Alliance Steering Committee, which has come to shared opinions and shared slogans that we want to discuss a bit further with LLA comrades and beyond. So we want to look at a few issues tonight. Firstly, we should say, I think we're all united in our distaste at the bourgeois media, the establishment media, how they're reporting it. Obviously, you read that, think Zelensky is the most wonderful, good-looking Messiah type, young, he's standing up, he's the best thing since sliced bread, etc. And obviously it's all just Putin's fault, who is the new Hitler, apparently, if not even madder than Hitler was. And Hitler was pretty mad. It was all about madness then, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. So we want to go way beyond that and dig a lot deeper than that. We also don't really particularly want to talk about sort of the hypocrisy at display. For example, that Russia has now been kicked out of FIFA and even the Eurovision Song Contest, whereas Israel, who's been doing horrendous things to the Palestinians for many decades, is still welcome even in the Eurovision Song Contest. It's not in bloody Europe, even they continue to remain part of that. So we don't really want to deal with those kind of issues, though they are distasteful as well. We want to look at our attitude. What should be the attitude of socialists, of Marxists, of communists, whatever you describe yourself, be to this crisis? It's, of course, a particular crisis specific, but there are issues around it, I think, that have come up in the past for hundreds of years, and which Marxists, socialists in the past have had to deal with as well, and we can learn a lot from them. That doesn't mean we're just looking at textbooks of Marx and Engels, etc., but we are, it's very important that we learn some lessons from our history. So we want to, I think we're very clear on the steering committee that we do not take sides in this conflict. We don't support NATO in the West. We don't support Russia. We also don't support the Ukrainian government, a very distasteful government, actually, that's been imposed by the West, that's been attacking people in the Donbass region for the last 8 years, etc. All three of these governments are anti-working class, reactionary governments. There is no need, from our perspective, LLA Steering Committee, to take sides. And unfortunately, that kind of puts us in a minority, I think, on the left somewhat. Most of the left feel the need to either go with, Russia is the bad guy, or it's just NATO that's the bad guy. Whereas I think we're quite united in saying that we believe they're quite both similarly evil, and we should stay away from them. So we want to look at a few issues. I'm suggesting we're dividing it up into these 4 sections. We're looking at NATO and what imperialism is doing in the area, what Russia is doing in the area. We have a small difference there, perhaps, I'm not quite sure. Is Russia imperialist or not? I think Matthew has a slightly different view, but it doesn't lead to different conclusions. So, and then we're going to look at sanctions. Are they an alternative to war? Could they achieve something positive? Are they a part of a diplomatic way out? Thirdly, then the question of self-determination. And lastly, and of course, that's kind of linked to everything we were discussing, is the question of what do we do, actually, what can we do as socialists here in Britain? So the first person to talk on this issue of NATO imperialism is Matthew Jones.
Yeah, hi comrades, and thanks for coming. I think it should be a good discussion. Obviously, very timely in terms of what's happening. I would say to start with, obviously, that the bourgeois media has even abandoned irony. There's a wonderful article showing how they're using clips from Palestine, showing the resistance of the Palestinians as Ukrainians and the actions of the Israelis as Russians. And that's being punted in the media. Of course, they won't show the real stuff, so they are. I think that the to start with, obviously, is to look at what is the motivation and the nature of the Russian regime. For obviously, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you have is an emergence of what is effectively a gangster capitalism. What they call oligarchs, and in fact, of course, basically is gangster capitalists who are essentially looting the country. Is what they're doing. It's been converted into effectively the extraction of primary resources, mainly metals and oil and gas. And I mean, if you look at, so obviously contrary to what Lenin says, and everybody should read Lenin, obviously, and how he defines imperialism. There may have differences with Lenin, and I think there's obviously things you can criticize Lenin for in that definition. But if we use it, and I think it's a good approximation on this question, it's quite clear that Russia is not imperialist, because actually what it is, as I say, it's basically looting the country. It's actually pumping money out of the country. It's not, as Lenin points out, and of course the imperialists are merely seeking to suck tribute out of the rest of the world. And in fact, the Russian oligarchs are doing the reverse. They're actually pumping money out of the country and then secreting it in Cyprus or Malta or, of course, London, which is where much of it goes. And of course, the effect of all this will be actually the hit on this is almost as much, I think, to London, the city of London, as it will be to Moscow, which is interesting. Actually, the evolution of the US's wars has actually hit the standing of the city of London and the finance world quite heavily each time. You can look at all of them. So the point being is, okay, what is the motivation then of the Russian oligarchs and their political operative Putin in invading Ukraine? I think a number of other people would say, okay, it's actually based on the fact that the pressure of the US and the clear effort of the US and its NATO allies to surround Russia, as also, of course, part of the US campaign against China, which, I mean, in turn is actually based on the decline of the US as a power, as an economic power, and its effort to try and control the rest of the world through military means as the ones left to it, which makes it incredibly dangerous to the whole of humanity, in fact, of course. So in those terms, and the fact that clearly they were angling to take over Ukraine, and they managed to use it as bait in order to get Putin to foolishly invade the place. I mean, very stupid in terms of, if you look at it. And of course, I mean, even in terms of the way they've done it, it's been done, even if you look at it on the straight military basis, they've done very poorly. They made a real mess, a total mess in those terms, and it's not going to go very well for them. So I would hand over to Roger for the next segment for that.
Roger.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, comrades, I couldn't resist starting by saying that, do you remember the idiot in 1991 who crowed, "This is the end of history," was the final triumph of liberal democracy? I think we'd agree he's a little premature. Since then, we've seen a bit more than our fair share of history. The recurrence of nightmares we thought had been relegated to ancient history: slump, plague, and war. So anyway, what is Putin's objective? I don't want to get involved in a sort of abstruse argument about the definition of imperialism. What is, I would say that in just the same way that the ruling class in Russia is not a developed capitalism, it's a gangster capitalism. And in terms of what they're doing in Ukraine, it's a determination to open up the right of plunder for these degenerate gangster plutocrats. The potential riches of the Ukraine economy, agricultural, mineral, and industrial resources. And what's the objective of the USA? The same, plus that they're intent on encircling Russia with hostile regimes and military bases. And this is the culmination of 3 decades of strategic tricks and maneuvers. The West was hell-bent on inflicting the humiliating and crushing defeat of Russia. They imposed, in 1991, they imposed the equivalent of a Versailles settlement. Does that justify the way that Russia is acting now? Does the crushing of Germany by the Versailles Treaty justify Hitler's conquest of Europe? So our first emphatic conclusion must be no excuses, no alibis, no hint of justification for Putin's act of sheer banditry. The crisis highlights the weaknesses of both sides. Putin's timing is prompted largely by the manifest loosening of the military grip of US imperialism, so graphically demonstrated most recently by its rout in Afghanistan. But another motivation is Putin's own compulsion to assert his bravado as his authority begins to crumble at home. He's alarmed by the full-scale uprisings that he's barely succeeded in suppressing in Belarus and Kazakhstan, Russia's two closest allies, and at the growing discontent within Russia itself, which he rules solely by thuggery and fear. Now, the invasion was met almost immediately with a flurry of protests at home. The Russian army is suffering unexpectedly high initial casualties. There are signs of discontent already from within the armed forces, including at least one reported mutiny. And there are cracks within the general staff. These are very ominous warning signs because, of course, as we know, incipient split to the top are always evidence of a coming groundswell of discontent from below. So Putin's adventure in Ukraine could well prove as catastrophic to him personally as the war in Afghanistan was for Gorbachev. Now, Putin started by justifying his invasion on the grounds of defense of the rights of the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk to self-determination, utterly cynical pretext. After all, tens of thousands of Chechens died fighting Putin's forces for precisely that very same right. But Putin very quickly moved and abandoned that excuse. His war aims shifted overnight to regime change in Kiev, and at the very least, the permanent partition of Ukraine, the incorporation of Ukraine's economically developed industrial area into Russia, alongside the installation of an impotent and compliant puppet regime in the West. And even the outright annexation of the whole of Ukraine is still not ruled out. Now, to justify this outrage, Putin has explicitly dredged up the most barbaric detritus of Tsarism. Remember that after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks had liberated the enslaved nations of Tsarist Russia and granted them statehood and autonomy up to and including the unconditional right of secession. They even created alphabets for the first time for previously solely vernacular languages. And in stark rejection of this democratic tradition, Putin has explicitly resorted to great Russian chauvinism and Russian Orthodox medievalism by rubbishing Ukraine's very national identity, dismissing it as an artificial construct, as he says, created by Bolshevik communist Russia, and adding the sinister comment, "We are ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine." Actually, it's of historical interest, but it would be more historically correct to say that it was Ukraine which created Russia. The origins of the Russian state lay in Kiev Rus 1,000 years ago, centuries before the foundations of Moscow were laid, and half a millennium before the creation of St. Petersburg. In any case, meanwhile, Putin is frantically hurling about insolent rationalizations, including a so-called wish to fight fascism. This from the spider at the center of a vast worldwide web of fascist and far-right conspirators, including his American stooge, Trump. So, having said that and made, I think, our position clear in relation to Russia, do we then support NATO, the EU, and the Kiev regime? The USA waged countless coups, invasions, and wholesale wars to impose regime change on countries throughout the world, from Guatemala to Vietnam to Iraq. The EU brazenly broke up Yugoslavia at the cost of massacres, ethnic cleansing, and civil wars. In flagrant disregard of their previous assurances to Gorbachev in 1991, they absorbed former Warsaw Pact countries and even former constituent parts of the USSR into NATO, bringing this hostile military alliance right up to the very borders of Russia. They betrayed the promises they made in the Minsk agreements to guarantee autonomy for the Russian-speaking regions in the east. They promoted color revolutions in a range of countries surrounding Russia and formerly within its sphere of influence, including Ukraine, where they fostered the growth of the Azov Battalion and other openly fascist paramilitary forces. So the meddling of the Western powers in Ukraine has no other motive but the exploitation of its population and of its economy. Still intent on swallowing up the rich agricultural, industrial, and energy resources of the region and consolidating their strategic advantage, they're waiting for the Russian invasion to collapse, leaving them to pick up the spoils. And meanwhile, as Matthew has mentioned, London is awash with rubles, or at least with dollars of the Russian plutocracy. It's infested with Russian billionaires, and the Tory party particularly thrives on their patronage. So to call on Biden and Johnson to intervene in defense of democratic rights flies in the face of history. So what are our demands? Russia, hands off Ukraine. Immediate withdrawal of occupation forces. Self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and Crimea on the basis of a genuinely democratic referendum. No support for the Zelensky government and its paramilitary forces, stooges of Western imperialism. No trust in NATO, the EU, Biden or Johnson. Solidarity with the people of Ukraine in defense of their democratic rights. And finally, solidarity with the workers of Russia in their revolt against Putin's gangster regime. So thanks, comrades.
Absolutely. Well put, Roger. It was worthwhile asking you to come and speak on this. I mean, you actually took notes beforehand. Thank you very much. I think that was a good summing up of the majority of the LLA's position on this as well. I would like to ask you both to actually explain, what do you understand the slogan, the main enemy is at home, to mean in this current situation? Matthew, could you?
Well, I mean, obviously, the first thing is to oppose our own ruling class and its miserable government, and obviously we should be calling for the dissolution of NATO as a predatory alliance, which is clearly there to carry out the dictates of US imperialism. We should be also pointing to the fact that clearly, we're against sanctions, which actually impact the working class, to go there to going to destroy the living standards of Russian workers, Ukrainian workers probably, and in fact, of course, this war will destroy the living standards of workers throughout Europe. I mean, in particular, I think it's going to affect a lot of people. But here, I mean, you're already looking at now, people will be receiving this week their messages saying that their gas and electricity bills will go up vastly in April. And that's before the effects of this war. The wholesale price of gas and electricity went up by in excess of 500 quid for an average customer last week alone. You're looking at another vast increase sometime later this year on the grounds of this war, and that's before you get to the other things, in terms of the other effects of it, and the other effects of sanctions.
Some people say, though, if you say the main enemy is at home, that means you're siding clearly with Russia, don't you?
Well, obviously, no. I mean, obviously, we support an anti-war movement. We support those people on the streets in Russia calling against the war. We support the interests of the working class as against all of these regimes. They're all filthy, and murderous, and particularly, obviously, our own. I mean, we refuse to get involved in this sort of notion of trailing after patriotism and all this sort of stuff, because it's actually just means you line up with all kinds of disgusting people and the ruling class itself, who are going to use this against us.
Does it mean, Roger, does it mean that we have particularly responsibility to deal with our own ruling class? Is how I always understood that phrase. How do you see it?
Absolutely. The working class is international. We support the working class of Russia. We support the working class of Ukraine. We have absolutely nothing in common with the capitalists who created this mess in the first place. And the hands of the capitalists in America, in Russia, in Britain, are dripping with blood from they created this problem. They created the encirclement of Russia, the promotion of fascist gangs in Ukraine. There's a long history of that, by the way. I was telling Tina earlier a little bit of family history, which I won't go into now. But the Ukrainian racism, Ukrainian anti-Semitism, Ukrainian fascism has a long history, and it's been actively promoted and financed by our ruling class. The only way that we can help the people of Ukraine is by fighting for socialism.
And to stop the war, obviously. I mean, we should, encourage comrades on Sunday. There will be anti-war activities in a number of cities as well as in London. So we'd urge comrades to go along to that. And we want to look next at the question of sanctions. And I have to say, I have been quite shocked about how many people on the left, when you look at your Facebook, I mean, how many people believe that is an alternative to war. That would be a good way to put pressure on Russia, on Putin, and will weaken him and his system. And, then all it needs is perhaps a little push by the people of Russia and they can get rid of him. Roger, do you want to start on with that one?
Well, sanctions are simply another form of warfare. And we are against the war of the capitalists. We're against any measures which come from our ruling class, our oppressors. So, I mean, I don't feel there's anything more to say about that. We have our own policy. We have the working class has its own policy of internationalism and of fighting against our ruling class. Whether they're using economic methods or military, their motives are against the interests of the working class internationally.
I would say also that there is an issue there, isn't it? If you actually put sanctions on Russia, you're not going to hit the oligarchs, are they? They've got their billions hidden away.
The oligarchs are sitting on their yachts. They've been moving their yachts around, so they're fine.
But what we're doing is we're potentially weakening actually the working class in Russia that is now protesting against Putin in increasing numbers, as Roger's pointed out. Matthew, do you want to say anything more on it?
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, obviously, what you have now is the world economy is integrated. You can't take it apart. I mean, Europe actually depends on Russia for 40% of its gas. Either you have Russian gas in Europe, or else the whole economy basically grinds to a halt. This was even more the case for China. Obviously, you can see in terms of the Americans' hostility to China, the fact that China is the biggest manufacturer in the world and makes everything known or bits of everything is a whole part of it. They couldn't do it. You can't disaggregate that. The world economy is the world economy. And obviously what they've done actually is going to hit mostly the working class. The thing is, I mean, what was interesting, of course, is the Ukrainian oligarchs left Ukraine in good time. I mean, they all left at least a week before this started because they knew it was going to happen. These guys are all insulated from this stuff. Actually, of course, it's the mass of people who are now faced with, not being able to buy food or other goods or even cars or houses or any of this sort of stuff. And it's actually a destruction of the living standards of the working class, not just in Russia but the rest of Europe as well. And it's in our interest to say, right, okay, we stand together. We are against this stuff. And we're in favour of a movement against all the ruling classes of Europe as basically all barbarians and people we need rid of, because they're actually destroying the basis of humanity and the basis of living.
There's a train of thought that goes, well, if the Russian working class, then, if they don't have, they lose their jobs, they lose their income, then the ruble is worth nothing anymore now. All the foreign assets been frozen, etc. Foreign reserves have been frozen, which means they can't be propped up. There will be inflation very soon, hyperinflation perhaps, which means people might not be able to get paid. Oh, well, if they're feeling the pressure enough and they don't have food, they can't buy food, they can't pay their bills, then they will rise up against Putin, which seems to, which implies the shittier your situation, your economic situation, the more likely you are to make revolution, which I think if you look around the world is not actually what usually tends to happen.
And Putin would be very, very glad of that alibi.
Go on, what do you mean?
Well, for the suffering of the population at home. You see, It's not me, it's look at the sanctions that have been applied. They're driving us, they're driving you into, we all got to stand together against the foreign enemy.
Yes, very good point. This would actually prop up probably the Putin regime. Very good point. Okay, last question then is the question of self-determination. There's two things to it. I mean, does Ukraine have the right to self-determination? Which again is something we hear, as opposed to, almost in contradiction to the Donbass region, which is of course these two regions that have been wanting to become autonomous, perhaps join Russia, etc. What are your thoughts on this? Maybe Matthew, start with this one.
Well, the thing is, I mean, obviously, clearly, the history of Ukraine is complicated in these terms, and has always been the case. Obviously, there is a Ukrainian speaking sections of Ukraine and Russian speaking sections of Ukraine, and in fact, of course, people will live together, and there's been no issue. In many cases, actually, of course, in Kharkiv, of course, it's a mixed city. There's the case for much of that section of Ukraine. The thing was, of course, that what happened, of course, after 2014 with the coup that was organised by the Americans and the Germans, the government the government they enacted, of course, which was of course influenced by all these sorted fascists and far rightists, then moved to discriminate against Russian speakers, remove Russian as an official language in Ukraine, and otherwise move against the Russian-speaking areas. Now, I mean, the Americans actually, of course, told them not to. Obviously they could see what was happening, and the uprising was fairly immediate after that. So it comes from that. That's where it's from. But of course, obviously, people should have the right to draw their own boundaries if they want to. But I mean, clearly, it's actually bound up with the sort of machinations that have been going on in Ukraine. And if it was a question of saying hands off Ukraine, all of these forces, I'm sure these things can actually be sorted out.
Roger, I've had discussions with people on the left who say, well, in general, yes, I'm in favor of self-determination, etc., because that's what socialists do. But in the case of the Donbass region, they will make the wrong decision and they will want to go with Russia. What do you think about that kind of interpretation of self-determination?
Well, there's so much confusion and dust thrown in our eyes about this by both sides, of course. First of all, I mean, it's not for us to determine whether the people of Donbass consider themselves Ukrainian or Russian or independent of both or whatever. But there's only one way to find out, and that's to ask them. It's just there's so many people who decided for them on both sides. So a genuine referendum for them to determine themselves, and that goes for every other equivalent case, including, for instance, whether Putin has raised the question whether Ukraine is a genuinely separate country from Russia. Well, it's not for him to say or for me to say; it's for the Ukrainian people to say. We have to be in favor of the universal right of people to determine their own status. It doesn't mean we advocate separation necessarily in any of these cases, but it's not our prerogative to decide. It's for the people of those regions.
Well, if you take it, I mean, obviously, in the fight for Ukraine, the civil war, and after the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, there was a separate Soviet Ukraine established with the capital in Kiev, and the world's first female president of any country was Evgenia Bogdanovna Bosch, of a Bolshevik president, the Bolshevik president of Ukraine.
Yep. Okay, let's get to our last point now, which is kind of what we've been talking about previously all the way through before we're opening it up to people from the floor, is what can be done, what can we do here, and what should be done if, as we say, sanctions, there's a difference with sanctions, for example, the BDS movement, where the working class internationally and in Palestine is supporting sanctions against Israel, and also socialists in Israel are supporting that, and South Africa, where the working class in South Africa also asked that sanctions be imposed. This is different now, and we have not heard of Russian socialists coming out and saying sanctions on us would be a bloody good thing. So we believe that sanctions are not the way to go, because they're an extension of the war rather than an alternative to the war. What can we do here in Britain then, Roger?
I'm afraid it's going to be a very tame answer.
Yeah.
What we do here is starts from what we're doing now, to understand the issues, to explain the issues, to help to build consciousness within the working class, and first of all within the more thinking and politicized layers of the working class, on what is the way forward towards socialism in Britain and internationally. Otherwise, apart from that, of course, expression of solidarity with all people suffering the effects of the war, solidarity with the people and the working class of Ukraine, but absolutely not with the government of Ukraine, with the victims of capitalism in Ukraine, and not with the perpetrators of their suffering. And that's got to be our position. I mean, of course, in terms of right of asylum and so on, we should be pressing for that. We do everything that is in the interests of our counterparts, our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, in Russia, and everywhere else. But absolutely no credibility given to Johnson, or to NATO and Biden, or alternatively also to the hypocrisy of Putin. So there we are.
Yep. Matthew, anything else?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with what Roger said. I just think the main thing is we need to build an anti-war movement, and we need to say, look, and also with a demand to remove ourselves from NATO, because it's a predatory and war fighting alliance, at the behest of US imperialism. We need to bring it down and have a movement to have it dissolved.
Yeah. And I think there's also, I mean, and if you compare the situation, it is a little bit similar to 1914. I think the run up to the First World War, where you see the international left basically collapsing in the face of war and drive to war, and a lot of people feeling they need to support their own government and be patriotic, etc. But we don't even have an international. I think that's becoming very painful in situations like this. There are international meetings. I think the Stop the War Coalition had some kind of international conference, but an organized working class across different countries, I think, it feels like an utter, such a void at the moment, that there is nothing like that at all. And I think, building links, especially with the anti-war movement in Russia, is now extremely, extremely important. And I've tried to contact some comrades that I know are involved in the anti-war movement in Russia, and I've known for a few years, and they're not replying, and they're not looking at their messages. You can see it with the ticks. And I do wonder, are they in prison? Have they been imprisoned in the anti-war protests? We don't know, because we have there's so few organizational connection at the moment. It's quite scary. That's definitely something that I think we have to look at. Thank you both very much. Stay with us. I think what we're going to do is now we're going to bring in people for comments and questions, and then we can see if either of you want to reply to anything and we take it from there. Okay, Tony, please.
I think we need to avoid the position which, say, anti-capitalist resistance are taking, which is that this is an inter-imperialist war between two sets of gangster regimes, if you like. It's quite clear that we have to look at the political character of this conflict. Actually, Trotsky had a few things to say on Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, when people, for instance, the Independent Labour Party, basically said a plague on both your houses, because they were both reactionary regimes. But we have to look at the social foundations of what is happening. It's extremely clear that, however mistaken Putin's invasion is, and it is a mistake, I think he fell into a trap of Joe Biden. There is no doubt in my mind that Russia has been on the defensive in the face of NATO expansion and NATO's war politics, and as has been said already, the sanctions that have been imposed, quite crippling sanctions, are war by another means. And we saw that in Iraq. Sanctions were the precursor to war. They weren't a substitute for war. They were the preparation for war. And that is what I fear could be the end result of the situation we have here. I mean, I woke up today and staggered into the supermarket and saw the racks of papers, and I couldn't believe it, from the kind of Mail to the Sun to the Mirror. All of them had pictures of children or civilian casualties on the front page. You know, you would have thought that the whole of the British press had become pacifist and anti-war, opposed to invasions by any country. But I just can't remember when it came to Iraq, where 1 million people died, where American aircraft or helicopters were circling, machine gunning civilians, including killing 2 Reuters journalists, and Assange is in prison at the moment for having revealed what happened. There were no such pictures. There was no such campaign. We're facing a full-blooded broadside from the ruling class in this country. The Guardian as well did exactly the same thing. The same Guardian, which effectively gave support to the Iraq war in the first place. So I think we do have to be very clear that we have a NATO which, despite all the assurances given to Gorbachev in 1991, and there's absolutely no doubt about that, has been continually expanding into Eastern Europe in 1999, 2004, and then in 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest declared that Ukraine and Georgia would be the next candidates for accession to NATO. And it was this that triggered it off, because in 2008, we had Russia going into South Georgia, if you remember, South Ossetia, after the civil war there. Their ruler believed erroneously that the United States would come to his rescue. So we have to look at this in the context of the United States, because of its own political and economic problems, is trying to maintain its position, hegemony in the world, both with China, the AUKUS Pact, and with Russia. We live in dangerous times. What do we do at home? I mean, the enemy is at home. Sanctions must be opposed fully. The hypocrisy of the NATO powers and Britain's membership of it must be at the fore of our own propaganda. And to call out the warlike nature of what is happening, because this situation with Putin's invasion of Ukraine could have been avoided very simply by a declaration that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO. It really was that simple. And if we see what was happening over the last few weeks, even when Zelensky was saying calm it down, Biden was ramping up the pressure. Ukraine is a sacrificial victim in many ways of the machinations of the US and the Western imperialist powers. but the question of self-determination, I think, is a secondary question. Self-determination isn't an absolute principle in all circumstances. It's often very problematic because Ukrainian self-determination, as it's interpreted, is a subjugation of the Donbass region. And that's not self-determining a nation, that's determining the future of other people, just as Israel's self-determination involves the oppression of others. In fact, the irony is in Tel Aviv, thousands of people were marching saying, hands off Ukraine, end to the occupation of Ukraine, oblivious of the fact that only 10 miles away there's been a perpetual half a century plus occupation. So we live in a world of total and utter hypocrisy, and we have to be able to try and counter the war propaganda that we are seeing. We know where it will end. They have money, unlimited money for weapons to send to Ukraine and so on, but they can't even find enough money down the back of the sofa to provide free school meals for children. I mean, that is the rank hypocrisy we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I'm actually going to bring in Richard Brenner now, who has a lot to say on the issue of self-determination. Can you unmute?
Hi.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, Tina. Hello. Thanks very much, everybody. So, this is clearly an inter-imperialist conflict. What we have is, on the one hand, a lesser imperial power seeking to establish its territorial expansion, seeking to resist the way that NATO is trying to build up its forces on its borders, and NATO and the EU and Britain seeking to station troops on the border of the Russian Federation. We have clearly a series of sanctions, and not just sanctions, but also a direct act of economic war targeting the Russian central bank, which prevents them from deploying $630 billion plus of Russian foreign reserves in defense of their currency, and therefore offsetting the hyperinflation which is ruining the Russian people as we speak. We also have not some kind of defense of the rights of self-determination of Donbass, but an all-out assault on Ukraine by the Russian Federation in the south, in the north, as well as in the east. So if we stand by the rights of nations to determine their own future, if we say that Ukraine has that right, just as Donbass does, and Tony tries to use the example of Israel to suggest that you can't have both of those things, but it doesn't work. You can afford Ukraine the right of self-determination at the same time as saying that the Donbass has the right to autonomy as afforded under Minsk II, or to separate if it wishes. The simple point, however, is that the fight is on to stop the labour movement taking sides on this issue. And in Britain, quite clearly, the main pressure from Starmer and increasingly from the left, including sadly today Diane Abbott, who has made her statement on NATO, what we have is an abandonment of the idea of not taking sides, and a clear endorsement of taking sides with Ukraine. Now, we know that people all over the country are rallying to the fact that Ukrainian civilians are suffering because their country is the one which appears to be immediately under attack. And of course, for 8 years, as Donbass was bombarded, as its right to self-determination was denied by the post-2014 Maidan regime in Kiev, we saw none of the images on the BBC of civilians being bombarded in Donetsk and Luhansk that we see now in Ukraine. So people's natural sympathies go out to the Ukrainian people. But clearly what we're seeing is two blocks in conflict. The right of self-determination we can uphold, but we must not support national defense of one or the other of those blocks. Instead, the task for socialists surely is to build an anti-war movement and to try to utilize the crisis engendered by the war in order to turn people against their governments and against the warlike and militaristic and rapacious regimes that are driving people into the fratricidal conflict that we're seeing today.
Good points. Thank you very much, Richard. Roger or Matthew, got anything to say before we bring in more people?
I completely agree with Richard.
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you for joining us, Richard. I know it's your daughter's birthday, so thank you for making the effort and coming along. Steve Freeman, please.
Muting myself. There we go. Yeah, I agree. Essentially, I think I agree what Richard's just said. I do think there are different kinds of wars. There are inter-imperialist wars, and the battle between NATO, America, EU, and the Russian Federation is an inter-imperialist conflict, as comrades have already said. And the position is we don't take sides on either side of that war. Except, of course, that because we're on one side ourselves, physically, geographically, then we have to be against our own ruling class. And that's been said so far. But we're not getting sympathetic with Putin because we see our own ruling class as the enemy. We give no support for an anti-working class, and the resolution says that, an anti-working class Putin regime, who is the enemy of that regime of the Russian working class. So we don't want it to look like somehow or other we are apologists for Putin, because Putin is merely the mouthpiece of the Russian ruling class. There's no such Russia in all of this. It's the Russian ruling class that we have to be talking about. Well, there we go. So there's a theoretical argument. Somebody's shouting to me, there is no ruling class in Russia. But we won't go into that. Anyway, so on the 24th of February, the character of the war changes. It changes when we're not sure what's going on. We don't know if Putin is actually, is he just bluffing, just trying to get a new deal with the Americans by putting all those troops all around NATO? He says he's not going to invade the place and stuff like that. And then, of course, he does. So on the 24th of February, the character of the war changes because of that invasion. And at that point, the people of Ukraine are organizing themselves to defend their homes, to defend their areas against a very powerful force. So it's a different war. This is not an inter-imperialist war between two imperialist superpowers, is it? It's actually an invasion and possibly an annexation, possibly the breaking up of Ukraine by that invasion. So it seems to me that, what do we think the working class in Russia is doing right now? Do you think they've left the country? Do you think they're arming themselves? And I believe that the working class movement, if we knew there would be, organizing to resist that Russian occupation. And therefore, we should be 100% in support of their defense of their country and their right to self-determination. That's what that seems to me. That's what it says. Hypocrisy. Well, of course, we can show up the hypocrisy, but we've got to make sure that we are ourselves not being hypocritical. We don't get caught up in our own forms of hypocrisy, you know, because you did mention boycott, divestment and sanctions. So we're not presumably in principle against sanctions being deployed. We just think it's a matter of who's doing the sanctions and what sanctions are they doing. And that's what you have to look at. What sanctions are we talking about and who's carrying out those sanctions? I mean, a general strike would be a sanction, wouldn't it? If the working class went on strike in Russia against the war, that'd be a pretty big sanction because it would knock a big hole in their profits. So that's a kind of sanction we might consider. And if we could expose the hypocrisy of the sanctions at this government and show how the City of London and all the money that's been stored there, that's really what we have to do. We have to expose the shallow and hypocritical nature of those sanctions and say the only sanctions that really counts is if the working class action on the streets, if people mobilizing in the streets, people taking strike action or whatever could stop that war. So, you know, let's occupy their houses. I don't know what we do. I saw a very powerful contribution of a woman today who attacked Boris Johnson in a meeting and said, it's all very well you talking about sanctions. Our kids are being killed in the street, and the children of this oligarch, these oligarchs are now walking around in London as if nothing could happen to them. There's some hypocrisy for you, and therefore Johnson speaking like he's a super Churchillian warmongering person whose hypocrisy should be exposed because the Tories are up to their neck in the money of the oligarchs in all of that. Now, self-determination, I'll come on to that point because Tina knows I don't quite agree with that. So first thing is that it is the right of nations to self-determination. It's not the right to self-determination. And the reason why it's the nations to self-determination, because it's strictly linking the concepts of people, nations, and citizenship to that. So as Republicans and Democrats, then we don't recognize the meaningless right to self-determination. For example, we don't recognize the right of languages to self-determination. We don't recognize the right of ethnic and religious groups to self-determination. For example, Jewish self-determination, Muslim self-determination, or the right of regions, such as the 6 counties of Ulster, to self-determination. That's where it leads. If you depart from the right of nations to self-determination, then you go right into a complete quagmire of politics if you do that, and you depart from democracy and you end up in a kind of anarchism where every individual can do their own thing and form their own country if they want. Perhaps I want maybe I should have some self-determination at that point. So, but what we do agree on, by the way, and this has always been the point, we as socialists want a peaceful settlement of the situation. That's what's always been the position. We don't want intercommunal violence of any kind. So, of course, we should support the right of autonomy for those regions within a new democratic settlement for Ukraine, possibly a federal structure and a new constitution. That seems to me, and the full equality for all languages, because you can't divide up Ukraine into Russian speakers live here and Ukrainian speakers over there. It's a mixed population, so you're dividing it up and doing all that kind of thing. That doesn't lead you anywhere. And at the end of the day, of course, those people in those warring regions, they should have a right to approve if we propose to them. So hopefully they'll vote for it. And if at the end of the day, I suppose ultimately you're not going to kill them over it or anything like that, but there's no right for them to form a state. That's just about annexation. Nobody thinks Donbass is a country or a nation or anything of that type. It's a region. That's all it is. Important though it is. But we don't want people in those regions and working class people to be killed over it. So that's what we need. So it's a dangerous situation. I think there's a good example. I'll finish on this point with Sudetenland, if you remember what happened there in 1938, because they had a German-speaking ethnic minority in Czechoslovakia, which of course Hitler and who was it? Hitler and the British did the Munich Agreement over, and then they handed over the Sudetenland to Hitler, etc. So that's how you get into those very, very difficult kind of situations. So I think we've got to be quite careful. I'll finish there. We should be supporting the working class people of Ukraine, because they are the ones. Just turn your telly on and see some of the pictures of what is going on there, and decide that that is not what we as socialists should have any support or anything for. We should support their resistance, completely support their resistance against that. I don't know whether what's his name is Kerensky. I'm not sure whatever they call him. Is he Kerensky or Alexinsky? I don't remember his name is, but anyway.
Thank you, Steve. I think this issue is actually worth us discussing a bit more. The self-determination question: do only nations have the right to self-determination? Ken put in the chat quite rightly. What about Catalonia? That's not a nation? Do they have the right to be autonomous, etc.? And Steve then actually said they should have the right to be autonomous. But to be honest, I'm not sure where you see the difference between them, having self-determination or becoming autonomous. But clearly, there's a huge democratic deficit, even if we accept that the 2014 referendum in the Donbass region was flawed, to put it mildly, and had, there was fraud involved, etc. That showed that about 90% of the people there do not want to be part of Ukraine and want an autonomous status. Even if we say it was only 80% or whatever, that's still a huge number. And clearly there is a huge democratic deficit, which of course has led to the war in the first place, with the Ukrainian government attacking it. So Roger, Matthew, what do you think on that question?
Come back and make a comment. I'm trying to come back and make a comment on that.
In terms of self-determination and secession and all this sort of thing, it gets frantically complicated. And some of it was, if you look at, say, Western Ukraine, for example, before the Nazis, of course, you had basically, a hodgepodge of Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and the Roma Sinti and so on. And of course, basically the place was more or less run by the Poles, who treated the Ukrainians and Jews badly. And everybody was, most people, the Poles and Ukrainians were pretty anti-Semitic. They treated the Jews badly. Everybody treated the Gypsies badly. The issue was sort of covered over by the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis, followed by Stalin turning up and expelling the Poles. But how you would actually unravel that, if you had, because the problem is that, okay, you say we can talk about. I think there's an issue in terms of the disintegration of capitalism, which has led to things like the whole business in Scotland here of Scottish independence, i.e. the system is actually falling apart, or national oppression. And the problem with national oppression in parts of Eastern Europe is one layer of it on top of another. And how would you resolve it? It's very difficult. And this was part of Lenin's effort. When he characterized Russia as a prison house of nations, and said, okay, we'll have separate autonomous areas for everybody, and attempt to unravel it in that way. And it was certainly an effort, and probably the best one that has been to date. But it's certainly not simple or easy to get to make it work.
Roger.
Well, I don't have much to add. The right of self-determination is an elementary democratic right, which of course we all support. It's not you don't. There are so many red herrings being brought in and. About who qualifies. It's clear that there is a certain definition of a nation, which is a common territory, often a common language, though not necessarily so, but above all, a self-awareness of itself as a nation, a consciousness, a national consciousness. And of course, there'll sometimes be cases where we quarrel about whether an area is a nation or not. I am not particularly pleased with the idea of a Northern Independence Party, because I don't think that the north of England qualifies as a nation. On the other hand, I have to admit that when the Scottish Nationalist Party Scottish National Party first began to grow, I'm talking about half a century ago, my initial reaction was, you can't say Scotland is a nation, but it obviously is a nation. It's got a national consciousness, and it has the right to determine its future. It doesn't mean I'm in favour of separation. I'm in favour of. I'm saying it's not my right to determine that question. It's for the people of Scotland to decide what their status and what their relations would be with England and so on. And I think, as far as Ukraine is concerned, it's quite clear. I can't say what the consciousness of the people in Donbass is, because we don't have any independent means of gauging their opinion. But it's for them to decide whether they consider themselves to be a separate nation or an integral part of Ukraine, or whether they should have some kind of arrangement of autonomy within Ukraine, or whether they should join Russia. As far as Crimea is concerned, it's a much simpler case. The people of Crimea, those that were not already removed, like the Tatars by Stalin, but the people of Crimea are largely Russians, and in fact, Crimea was a part of Russia. Even after the creation of the USSR, it was not part of Ukraine, it was part of Russia. And it was on a sort of drunken whim of Khrushchev that he suddenly decided to make a present of the Crimea to Ukraine, because it didn't really matter much, because Ukraine was part of the USSR in any case. I'm quite prepared to accept the probability that the people of Crimea would prefer to be part of Russia, because that is in line with their whole culture and their whole history. The people of Donbass, I don't know, but it's their right to decide. So anyway.
Thank you, Roger. Got to move on to the next speaker, but I think also that there is a question that we fight for the right to self-determination for people to split if they want, but of course we're internationalists and we want working class unity. Actually, we believe the working class should be as united as possible because it makes us stronger. And one way to actually achieve that might be the demand, supporting the demand for self-determination and showing people we're not actually going to oppose turn around the poles of oppression. We're not going to oppress you. We're fighting for your right to split away, but we hope you won't. And we're showing you we are, democratic forces, and you should stay with us. We fight for you. We hope you fight with us. The next person I was going to bring in is Marion.
Yeah, I think we're in very, very dangerous times at the moment. And I think I am disgusted with the state of the so-called revolutionary left, let alone the centrists and all the other variants, because people don't realise what state we're in. It is crystal clear what the aim of the US, NATO, the EU, Britain is. It wants to destroy Russia, and it wants to destroy China's ability to change the world order. It was crystal clear when the leader of the EU said we've got to sanction Russia, we've got to attack Russia because they're trying to upset the current world order. That is crystal clear. So we have to make sure that they do not win. Now, that doesn't mean to say I'm pro-Putin. I'm not pro-Putin. I've been an anti-Stalinist, and I've wanted the implementation of the full Russian Revolution ever since I became a proper Marxist. I used to think I was a Marxist when I wasn't. So let me get that absolutely clear. The other thing is, I was at a protest in Birmingham last night, and a lot of it was so simplistic. Russia bad, Ukraine good. There weren't anti-NATO banners there as well, which was important. But our key task in this country is to stop the military-industrial complex in this country, the arms industry, from existing. That is our task. That is the biggest task we can be. And we have to oppose sanctions. Sanctions are another form of war. And they want to destroy Russia. Now, I'm not going to get into this whole thing about whether it's gangster capitalist or capitalist. I still think it's a transitional society. But we can have that academic debate another time. But if you don't see what the Western imperialist aim is, which is to destroy any possibility of anybody changing their worldview. So if we want to bring peace to the world, if we want to bring socialism to the world, we have to fight our own imperialists at home, destroy the military-industrial complex and the arms industry. And we have to be so strong that we want the NATO disbanded. And I'm absolutely appalled at the so-called misleaders in the PLP who have abandoned principles. I don't believe Tony Benn would have done that. I really don't. And I think it's an absolute disgrace. We're totally rudderless now in terms of any leadership in the PLP. So where do we go from here? We have to build a movement and the other key thing is the West doesn't want a ceasefire now. It's putting weapons into Ukraine, and you've got Germany doing it, Switzerland doing it. Lots of the countries that were supposedly neutral are now coming in on the side of NATO. And why is that? Because it's in the capitalist interest to do so. One of the questions that I want answered is, if Russia and China were just gangster capitalists or capitalists, why are they going after them in the same way? There's inter-imperialist conflict between Germany, EU, and America and other countries, but they don't go to war on this scale with them. So that's a question that maybe somebody could answer for me. But as I say, that my main thing is I want to bring about world socialism, and the people in Putin could have played things slightly different. He could already have cut off the gas and all to Europe if he'd have wanted to, because of what's happening to him. But he fears being overthrown by the Russian working class more than he does imperialism. And that's the thing. For me, who overthrows Putin is key. If it's a Russian working class on a socialist program, then that would be a good solution. But if we allow the Western imperialists to do it, it won't be a good solution. And the blatant hypocrisy there's been, I'll wind up now, the blatant hypocrisy and the white Eurocentric racism that we've experienced in this past period makes my blood boil. You know, the fact you had Yugoslavia was a European war before, but what's happening in Yemen today? What's happening, and who's providing the weapons for it? And we don't hear a word. And for the last 7.5 years, we haven't heard about the Eastern Ukrainians in the Donbass that have been murdered and killed, over 13,000. Don't their lives matter? And the blatant hypocrisy of people, well, sorry, makes my blood boil. But as I go back to our main task is to defeat our own ruling class and to stop the militarism in this country. And that's something we can all agree on, and that's what we should be uniting on. But don't underestimate them.
No, thank you very much, Marion, for your passionate contribution. Always appreciated. Comrades, either of you got anything to say on the question, perhaps why this drive for war? What do you think is really behind it? Roger, Matthew?
I think we should let some of the comrades speak at the moment, I think.
Yeah, okay. Simon, please.
Thanks. I'm Simon Hines. I'm from Islington North. Right. Firstly, I think focus on the working class, Russian working class, may in fact be a distraction, because in terms of Russia, I think the Russian working class supports Putin. The opinion polls over a number of years have been very clear. Russian people support Putin. And in this case, the last opinion poll I've seen, the Russian people are still supporting Putin. I think what's happening at the moment is basically a clash of world orders. And on the 4th of February, both Putin and Xi Jinping put out a 5,000-word declaration on international relations that was basically a rejection of the world order being fashioned by the West. This world order being fashioned by the World Economic Forum, and is about the Great Reset. This war is really a war between competing notions of a world order. In terms of Russian invasion, I think it actually could be argued that Russia has a right to invade Ukraine. I'll repeat what I've said. It could be argued in terms of international law that Russia has a right to invade Ukraine. That doesn't mean they should, but they've got a right to. And that is because on the 24th of March, 2021, the Ukraine put out a declaration that said they wish to retake Crimea, and the means by which they're going to do that included military, i.e. that was a declaration of war against Russia. Now that declaration can be said to be based on a lie, because obviously Russia didn't invade Crimea. There was a poll by Gallup poll on the in 2014 that stated that 68% of Ukrainian people regarded the secession of Crimea as legitimate. That's not what Crimean, that doesn't include what the Crimeans people think, but this is Ukrainian people who are saying that. It also should be said that you know, we're told that Russia invaded Georgia. That's not true either. There was a report by the EU that actually admitted that the military actions of Georgia triggered that conflict. As I said, we've got a war about the new world order. But the West want to break up Russia and break up China to enforce its world order. I don't support that. I think Russia should withdraw, but Russia needs to have its security concerns addressed, which is what was accepted by Macron and Schulz when they spoke with Putin. So this notion of Russia wishing to expand or Putin to Hitler, blah, 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 that seems to me was answered by Schulz and Macron, who agreed that there were legitimate security concerns that Russia had. Thanks.
Oops, thanks, Simon. Roger, Matthew, anybody want to reply? No, okay. All right, Jerry, before I get more grief from you, come on in then.
All right, thank you.
With their hands up.
I did have my hand up right from the beginning, so.
As had lots of other people.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. All right, but the point I want to make is that I think Marion made the best speech here, and I also agree strongly with Tony Greenstein, and I agree with Matthew. I think the principle that we start off with is the main enemy of every people is in their own country. Karl Liebknecht's famous speech of famous pamphlet of May 1915, the enemy of the German people is in Germany. German global imperialists, the German war party, the German secret diplomacy, the enemy at home must be fought in political struggle, cooperating with the proletariat of other countries. So that's really accepted by most people. What is the big political difference here in this meeting is clearly whether or not Russia is an imperialist country. Of course, if Russia is an imperialist country, we'd be for dual defeatism, we'd be for the defeat of NATO and imperialism and those that live in the Britain and the United States and NATO countries, and in Russia we'd be for the defeat of Russia. But I very strongly suggest that Russia is no way an imperialist country. It can't approach in any way the size and strength of its NATO opponents. And not alone that, economically, it cannot enter into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that controls the economy of the entire planet. Both Russia and China are excluded from that. So, for instance, the United States can place sanctions on Iran, and it can sanction everybody else that won't sanction Iran. So it has that economic power. What else we are missing here, although it has been mentioned, is that in fact that government in Kiev is an illegitimate government. It was a government that was installed by a coup, organized by the CIA and organized by United States. We know that because Victoria Nuland boasted about the $5 billion they had spent in order to achieve that. And we know about her speech where she said, fuck the EU, and she was going to put in her yachts as the president, which she duly did. So it is a completely puppet government, and a puppet government that was installed by explicitly fascist forces. The right sector and the Azov battalion are self-declared Nazis. The Ukraine is the only country on the whole planet that has a national holiday for a Nazi. Stefan Bandera, the 1st of January, is the anniversary of his birth, and that's a national holiday. There are monuments to him all over Western Ukraine, and also Ukraine is the only country in the world that has specifically a Nazi battalion within its army. The Azov battalion and the right sector are the people that organized the murder in the trade union house on the 2nd of May 2014. They then went on to Mariupol and attempted to smash the resistance there, and it was specifically against Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. They boasted that they had roasted the Colorado beetles in the trade union house. So it's the only country in the world that has an explicitly Nazi battalion. They wave the swastika and the wolf's angle quite openly. All right, I've only just started. They were.
Jerry, you've been going for 4 minutes, so can you start winding up, please?
All right, look, the situation is that this explicit Nazi collaboration within it is being called out by the Jerusalem Post, for instance. They pointed out that the West are training these people, and one of the things was that the Jews were the destruction of humanity, and they shared a post that the Jews have tried to exclude Ukraine from the world history and map. And of course, they have a Jewish president. He's not very happy about the situation, and whatever about Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, they just could not operate as long as the Azov battalion was leading the fight. The other thing I'm for the defeat of Ukraine in this battle. I don't call for the Russian troops to withdraw. Pleasingly, you will have heard that in Mariupol, the Azov battalion is surrounded and is about to be eliminated, and that will be a good thing for the future of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Okay, anybody wants to reply to that? Probably not. Okay, Minnie. Okay, comrades, I will have to start properly timing people now because we have to finish this meeting at 7:45. Hi, Minnie. 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, what I want to say first is, if anyone hasn't watched the Abolition of the Army one that LLA put on, please do. I really thought it was interesting and educational. First thing I want to say is about Zelensky, and obviously we have the capital's curtain, tax havens, etc. What's hiding behind the faces, and Zelensky, the Pandora Papers, he's in there, and there's a paragraph here in an Al Jazeera article that says Zelensky's businesses partners include Ivan Bakanov, don't know who he is, current head of the SBU, Ukraine's main intelligence agency that often investigates corruption cases, and President aide Serhii Shafir, who administers the offshore companies but shares the profits with Zelensky's wife. So there's just so much stuff going on, and he's being bigged up now as a hero and all the rest of it. Yeah, and one thing that I heard in that abolition the other night, I don't know how you lot just talk straight to it. I've just scribbled notes because I'm on camera. Right. Yeah, the political wing of the armed forces is Parliament. And that's probably true of a lot of parliaments everywhere. We're in such a dangerous situation. For example, I think Poland might have offered for Ukraine to fly their planes out of Poland. If they do so, that's a NATO country, Poland, and Russia will see it as an aggression, obviously a NATO aggression. Also, there's talk now, cheerleaders for sending as many dangerous arms as possible to Ukraine, no matter what kind of arms they are, and also a no-fly zone. If there's a no-fly zone, then Russia will see that as an aggressive action, and you know, we could be at war. Basically, I'm saying we could be on the brink of war. It's so dangerous. These ruling classes are so dangerous. They have to be gone off. The 40-mile line of Russian tanks approaching Ukraine. Will the ruling class on this side want to take that out? It's just so dangerous. I think the chilling on the democracy subject, the shutdown of democracy in the Labour Party is chilling. And the cheerleading, like I was saying, of all the buying of the weapons is chilling. I don't like what Russia's done. I don't like what NATO does. And on the breakup, self-determination, I did join the Northern Independence Party briefly for a few weeks because I can't stand the Labour Party. I used to be in that. And I found the same opportunists. For example, pushes of AS inside there. There were so many opportunities in political fishing in political ponds. So we need a mass movement. We need a mass movement, and we need to join up in all these countries against these imperialists, against these wars. We need socialism and peace. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Minnie. Sorry to rush comrades along. We've had over 100 people in this meeting, and clearly it's a subject people feel very strongly about. So I'm trying to get as many people in as we can. Sandy, please.
Well, comrades, I missed the initial contributions, but I've heard the last 20 minutes. The first point I would make is that we're witnessing a big step to the right in the Labour movement, with a section of the far left going over to support imperialism. Groups such as the USFI, the AWL, etc., plus quite a few individual comrades that have been on the far left for a while, are now going along with this victory to Ukraine nonsense. Very reactionary positions. Obviously, most of you have heard of the Paul Mason speech, where full-on support for imperialism, for rearming NATO, etc. Very reactionary development on the left itself. And we're in a situation where the mass media is just full of pro-war propaganda, trying to hypnotize the mass of the population with that kind of guff, at a time when working class living standards are under attack and are going to be even more under attack. So I think part of the reason for the NATO war drive against Russia is the internal contradictions within capitalist society itself and the growing inequality there is. And what we really need is a real anti-war movement that doesn't just take up the question of opposing NATO and opposing the attack on Russia, but takes up the questions of the growing social inequality and attacks on democratic rights. And if we could build a movement like that, we would actually be starting to affect politics in the sense that the ruling class would start to worry that if it continues to pursue this war drive against Russia and eventually China, it's going to face major opposition from the working class itself. But to do that, we have to break with the Labour Party, the Starmers, the people that are on the soft left, the Owen Joneses, all these people that are actually giving left cover for the attack on Russia. And I think what we have is an imperialist attack from Russia. Ukraine's been used as a proxy. That's the reality of it. And we can see how the capitalist class is uniting in this fight. You know, the Americans have managed to reassert their authority over Europe. The Germans have accepted the Nord 2 not going ahead. The society generally is, the capitalist class are trying to rally people to that war effort, and we have to be very strong against it. I don't agree in any way with victory for Russia or, you know, supporting the Russian intervention. I think it was a reactionary move by Putin. Understandable if you look at it in terms of the war drive, but some that the working class people can't support because the Putin regime is a counter-revolutionary, anti-working class regime, and we don't support their actions. So I think it should be clear that the main enemy is at home. We can unite on that, and we can say we want to end NATO, we want to disband NATO, and we want to build an anti-war movement that takes up the fight to improve working class living standards, to fight social inequality and defend democratic rights.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, we were talking earlier about the need for a new international that's not just anti-war, but actually, you know, pro-socialist as well. So thanks for that, Sandy. We have different views on the question of the Labour Party. We're not going to go into this now because that's going to break apart our meeting, clearly. Okay, Anthony, for 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be very brief and stick to the time. Essentially, what I'm going to say is the difference between the Yeltsin wing of Stalinism and the Putin wing. Yeltsin came under extreme capitalist pressures to privatize, pillaging, I mean, it's cutting back on public expenditure. Bureaucratic pillage and capitalist restoration may not be the same thing. Bureaucratic pillage is a bureaucratic cash. And some of the blocks here are bought off. But there's a financial crisis in 19. I'm not going to lie, the capitalist banks collapsed. And it moved more towards a planned economy under Putin. And when they tried to overthrow the rest of the blocks in Serbia, they're operating in Russia. And that's why I'm not surprised. I've been talking about 12 months about a major crisis. People underestimate the planned economy in this situation. I think there's a recomposition of the left going on, and nobody's mentioned the danger of nuclear war. When I watched, what's her name, when the crisis broke out, about 3 hours after I was up from 4 in the morning, when the crisis broke out, what's her name? I can't remember her name now. What's her name? I can't remember her name. But she's from Britain and so on. She's saying NATO read there could be a nuclear war in between. It's more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis because they're trying to knock out the Russian missiles that can manage to dominate the world in that situation. What they do, if they West overthrew Putin, there'll be mass privatizations, all the pensions were cut because he's renationalizing, he's getting mass increases. It's a big improvement from Yeltsin, despite his styles, and that's why the older workers will defend him. And he's right to support the intervention. He's stopping the restoration of capitalism in Ukraine, and as Jerry done, he's smashing the fascist elements. And this could have I think there's also the fear of communism. And Stalin's not tied up with that. I don't know. Well, I've said this to other people. I might say here, then I'll conclude. I think with the communist movement in Europe and America, 40% of the middle class with Britain, Western Europe, this Mandel talks about better dead than red. And that's very dangerous in the concentration camp in the Second World War. They're laying the basis for a nuclear war in order to, because I think they're going to be overthrown rather than go down and lose all their wealth to capitalists. Interesting. Some may want the life and death penalty, but our priority is to get billions on the streets to stop the nuclear war with Russia. And there's I agree with Tony Greenstein's going to the left, Steve Fruman's going to the right. Further recomposition is interested in this meeting. But if you want to know my writings, I've got 5 blogs called Anti-Brain Trotskyism, and you can look my writings up. I've been writing for 15 years. I've been writing since I've been 15, documents in different groups. I lost some of the documents different ways. People have got the documents, and I'll get it at some point. But this is very dangerous if they close RT down, because my website will be closed down, because I'm a major threat to capitalism. I'm not naive about Stalin. The people I'm working with, well, I'm going to be surprised they don't execute me in China, but it's over there. But in
Wind up now, please.
One more point, imperialism is the main pressure in our country. Find Stalinism in Russia and China. It's a parallel. I talked about that a few weeks ago. I'll leave it there. But thanks for letting me tell my point of view.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade. I think maybe RT might be a slightly bigger problem for capitalism than your blog, but we are against closing down any blogs or any media outlets at all. It's just been pointed out to me something that I missed when Jerry was speaking. He was pointing out that Zelensky is Jewish, as if that explains anything. I don't think we should have any track with that. If you'd said Zionist, you'd had a point that the fact he's Jewish plays absolutely no role in his politics. I don't think we should go down that road. John, please.
Thanks, Tina. I think a lot of people are getting quite carried away with the notion that Ukraine, although they don't actually state it, that Ukraine is riddled with fascism, both at a popular level and at a military level. 1 battalion in an entire army means very little. I mean, you can have specialist battalions, you can have the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, etc., was militarily insignificant. And I think the constant raising of the issue of the Azov battalion and the role that was played by fascists in the events of the Maidan in 2013 or 2014, whenever it was, I forget. I think you have to roll the whole situation back and realize that there was quite a strong move for joining the EU within Ukraine. It was a popular move, particularly in Western Ukraine. And that was what carried, what forced the resignation of the previous president, because he went against that. And it was that which provided the moment, and the moment was seized by a load of different forces, among which were fascists, but there were lots of others too, just as the Iranian Revolution had lots of forces within it, and any revolution has lots of forces within it, to be honest. I also don't think that you have to be arguing equivalence between Russia and NATO or Russia and the United States. I mean, I've seen some people posting in the chat about Russia only has 10 bases in the world, whereas the Americans have, I don't know, 10 or 15 times that number. That doesn't matter. They're not equivalent imperialisms, but they are imperialistic. There is a move within Russia which started in Transcaucasia, which went on to Kazakhstan, which then went on to Belarus, and is now going on to Ukraine, which is to solidify and back local autocrats who are willing to adopt the leadership from Moscow as a means of actually continuing to rule their countries. And Ukraine needs to be seen as an extension. I also want to just make a quick
wind up now, comrade, please. No,
okay.
3 minutes. Thank you.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you, mate. You have indeed. Harry, please, as the last speaker from the floor, and then we're going to have summing up from the main speakers. Hi, Harry.
Hi, comrades. You know, over the last 30 years, right up to a week ago, there has not been two aggressors that has led to this crisis. There has been one aggressor. And you go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990-91. There, if you remember that Gorbachev and Bush met in Reykjavik, Gorbachev did something quite extraordinary. He conceded to the reunification of Germany. And it was under a proviso. It wasn't a treaty or written down, but on Gorbachev's terms, not one more inch. What has happened for 30 years is the expansion of NATO. And we should define NATO. What does it really stand for? NATO is the expansion of the American empire. All the NATO countries, any country that steps outside the demands of what America demands, will find themselves thrown out of the international exchange mechanism. They've all followed suit. Since then, as you know, the history right down the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania has all gone to the European Union. Countries like Poland's joined the European Union, maybe not NATO. And now, whether or not you like it, no matter what you think of Putin and Russia, Ukraine is seen by Russia as a strategic country for their defense, both economically and otherwise. We would have to defend even Putin at the expansion of an aggressive force that is now right up to their border. Exactly the same with China. The massive American naval base build-up around the South China Sea is now encroaching in Taiwan. And now China has responded, not something we would agree with, I know, but China has responded. Any interference with Taiwan, there will be a military response. That is how dangerous now this situation is. The situation in Ukraine now has gone way beyond the country. The concentration of America now is in Russia itself. What Putin has done a week ago has been the biggest strategic blunder anyone could make. It has united NATO. It has united the West in every possible way about the sanctions, the closing, the censorship of the media, throwing Russia out of the international exchange mechanism, the build-up of military now, for Germany for the first time is excessively now expanding their military machine, not a defensive force, an aggressive force that NATO will use now against Russia itself. This is a very serious now situation because all the eyes are on Russia now itself, possibly an invasion, possibly an extension of NATO towards Russia. That is something that every one of us now must be concerned with, because it could now be blow into a full-scale war, might bring China into that war itself. And as somebody mentioned about nuclear weapons there, what Putin said a few days ago about excessive force that might be used, he was hinting that he may indeed use nuclear weapons to defend any if Ukraine falls into the hands of the European Union. I mean, what's our position in all this? I mean, we're talking about self-determination. In principle, we would support self-determination. But what we need to point out is self-determination is often not the answer. I live in Northern Ireland. We talk about self-determination. We had self-determination on the border of United Ireland or staying with Britain. It would probably split right down the middle. It's not a solution. Self-determination, what we have got to do is to explain that self-determination and nationalism is something that will not bring about any solution to any problems. The demands that we're putting forward in this, no to war, demilitarization of Ukraine and so on, what's missing is a socialist program. We should be demanding in this program the nationalization of the wealth of all countries, energy, banks, all other institutions are nationalized in all countries and are brought under the control, democratic control of the people. We need that program that's there. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks very much, Harry. I think you made some really interesting points on the danger of how this could actually go really, really pear-shaped really quickly, which gives more, need for the working class in Russia to overthrow Putin before it goes too far. And as other people have said, the NATO and the West, they want regime change as well, but they will impose it from above. They will try to put somebody in Putin's place so they can, run and have another puppet regime there. So I think a lot of very interesting issues were raised. I just want to say one more time that because I missed it when Jerry was discussing it, he was making a big thing about Zelensky being Jewish. I think this is a very dodgy territory to go down. It's not his Jewishness that is the problem. It's that he's a Zionist and he works with fascists. Zionism and fascists, they can work very well together, and they have done in the past, and they go hand in hand in Britain as well. So that's not an issue. So, but I don't think we need to peddle anti-Semitic crap here in this session. So comrades, there's lots to pick up for Roger and Matthew. So who wants to go first? Oh, nobody. Okay, I'll decide then. Matthew.
Okay, fine. Thanks, comrade. No, I think it's been a really useful discussion, in terms of, obviously what people have said. Obviously don't agree with all of it. But I think the main thing is to look at, well, what do we do? I mean, obviously, under conditions, as people have pointed out, the possibility of a more general war or a nuclear exchange is real. The fact that the working class is facing, basically a huge attack on living standards throughout, certainly throughout Europe and probably large chunks of the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at them in the US, working class now is suffering. The rate of poverty in the US now is ridiculous. The question is, what is the response under conditions in which, governments suddenly having declared, that the cupboard is bare for years or whatever else, and they've got no money and so on. Suddenly, when it comes to wars, they turn up with huge sums of money, and they're quite prepared to destroy whatever. There's no interest in building anything or keeping anybody alive, but they're quite prepared to spend vast amounts in destroying whatever and whoever over a prolonged period of time. Our question is to build, one, a mass anti-war movement. Two, that we are against NATO as a clearly a US directed predatory alliance, which is clearly against the interests of humanity, besides the working class, humanity itself. We are also against sanctions, because those two are actually destroying the living standards of workers. We are in favour, obviously, we support the anti-war movement in Russia, we support the anti-war movements in the rest of the world, and we call on people to rise up. And I agree with comrades when they say, well, we should be saying, look, this does point up. It sharpens the point that this system itself is bust. It's incapable of actually delivering for most of the people of the world, besides a tiny handful, effectively. I mean, the number of major capitalists now is getting down to, you can almost list them, and these people run the world. And we should be saying, well, okay, basically they are engaged in looting from the rest of us. And it is time for us to build a different form of society in which things are under the control of the mass of people, i.e. socialism.
Thank you, Matthew. I think it's also worthwhile pointing out how World War I ended. That wasn't capitalists seeing sense, etc. It was mutinies. It was the soldiers saying, back off, we're not doing this anymore. We've had enough of this crap. And the officers kept saying, you should go, you should go. And the soldiers turned around and shot the officers instead. And I think that's exactly the right attitude. Roger. You're muted, comrade.
Yeah, on your last point, absolutely. That is what we have to keep bearing in mind. The working class has no interest in supporting either set of capitalists, either set of parasites. We've had a lot of discussion on the nature of Russia, whether it is imperialist or not. As I said at the beginning, I think we have to understand that the Russian capitalism is completely parasitic. It's not. It is not productive. It plays the role of plunderers and predators. And of course, the main enemy in the world is imperialism and capitalism. And we have to see everything in the context of the need to defeat capitalism and overthrow capitalism. That doesn't mean we support weaker sides in or anything. It means that we have no truck with any of them. If I'm trying to take an analogy, but I mean, if I'm cheated by a bank of all of my possessions, or if I'm robbed in the street by a pickpocket, we don't choose between them. The fact is that the banks have the power and they have a stake behind them, and therefore they're the main enemy, if you like. But it doesn't mean that we feel any kind of solidarity or sympathy with the small-time thief and the pickpocket. If we're robbed or exploited, it makes no difference. And the Russian regime is a gangster regime. Of course, the responsibility lies with world imperialism and with capitalism, and the American ruling class, which has provoked and created this problem by its determination to plunder, not just to plunder, but to exploit the world's resources, and who have used this in the most provocative way in order to surround Russia. We've gone through all that and so on. I don't think anybody here is saying that we should support the Zelensky regime. I didn't hear anybody say that. I don't think it's necessary to go into that. The fact, I don't know how many of the Ukrainian population are sympathetic to fascism. I don't know how many are racist or what. It's not really, that's of academic interest. The point is that we stand for the rights of the working class in Ukraine and in Russia. We take no sides. We are for our class. We're for the working class of the world. And I mean, we see this thing about imperialism I mean, there are so many paradoxes on this. Britain ruled India for more than 2 centuries. At the moment, the only almost the only car plant that still exists in Britain is owned by an Indian industrialist, by Tata. India is an imperialist power within its sphere of influence, within the oppressed nationalities of the Indian subcontinent. Sri Lanka, in relation to the Tamil areas, we don't differentiate. There's the oppression, the exploitation, and the plunder of the resources. We don't support the little ones against the big ones, the little predators against the big gangsters. We take no sides. We stand for international workers' solidarity.
Workers have no nation, right? As a very clever man put it. And this is actually the time where we have to say we refuse to be divided along national lines. These are the good ones, these are the bad guys. We have more in common with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and on Russia on the ground than we have with NATO going bombing places, etc. So I think that was a really great session, actually. Thank you both, Roger and Matthew, for explaining the LLA's position, and thank you for the audience for coming in and making mostly good contributions and clever questions. I enjoyed it very much. I hope comrades have learned a lot tonight. I hope you also come along on Thursday. We'll be discussing in our series Abolition, the abolition of the patriarchy, which is a way for radical anthropologist Camilla Power to present her theories, which are fascinating, about women, how women made the human revolution, actually, that it's down to women solidarizing, which has led to us becoming humans, and how it was overturned again. It's a really fascinating subject. So I have comrades will be joining us at that. And have you all a good evening. And we will probably be revisiting this issue and other issues. I think it worked quite well. We've had over 100 people in the audience. It clearly shows that there's a desire to have a democratic and open discussion with the chat open. I think that also makes it quite unusual that we have the chat open. Most organizations don't do that. Thank you all for being here tonight, and see you soon. Bye, comrades.
Thanks, comrades. Bye-bye.